So welcome to this session. We timed it today, obviously, to link to the release of the Rothamsted virus forecast on Friday. Mark will take you through that in a little while. Just to let you know, the form for these meetings, we don't have any formal presentations. I know many of you were at BeetTech, and many of you may have seen the first two editions of the advisory bulletin, and there's some YouTube videos and some Beetcast podcast to listen to. So it's very much your opportunity for you to ask the team, the BBRO team, questions on topics which are relevant to you. I know sugar beet drilling is probably a little bit far from your mind because there's so much other spring work to do, but it is an opportune moment just to have kind of pause breath, if you like, and have some discussions. But I guess many of you will be interested in the virus forecast and the implications of that. So Mark, can I hand over you to just kind of give a brief summary of what it is and what we need to think about going forward?
Thank you, Simon. Good afternoon, everybody. And as Simon's nicely highlighted, we were waiting on the forecast from the Rothamsted scientists from the insect survey last Friday morning. And I'm sure many, if not all of you, are fully aware that the virus yellows forecast for 2024, in the absence of any control strategy, was 83%. Now, the importance of that figure is it's above the DEFRA trigger point. If you also remember, DEFRA announced in the second week of January this year that we would be able to use Cruiser if the virus yellows forecast was above 65%. And clearly, with the weather pattern we've had in January and February, we've exceeded that by almost 20%. So it does mean that the crop is at risk. And in addition to the figure of 83%, Rothamsted also indicate when the first aphids are likely to fly. Now, given that January was averaged to slightly warmer than the longer term average, followed by probably one of the warmest Februaries on record, with up to 4 degrees warmer than the long-term average, and with very few ground or even air frosts, we are anticipating the first winged aphids to come into sugar beet from the 10th of April. Now, to put that into context, last year the virus yellows forecast was high, but not quite as high as this year, and it was at 67%, with aphids anticipated to arrive around about the 22nd of April, which they did. But it's not quite the extreme that we saw in 2020, when the aphids were predicted to migrate from the third week in March. But as you can see, we do have a very high risk situation when the mean temperature for the entire sugar beet area is around about 6.4 degrees. So we are gearing up, sadly, to the threat of a virus yellows year. But you need to remember that the virus yellows forecast is in the absence of any control strategy. And although it is sort of between the last 2 years and 2020, what we didn't have in 2020, which clearly we do have on around about 60% of the crop this year, is that it will be protected by Cruiser SB. So if you have chosen the seed treatment and when you sow it, you will get 10 weeks protection from BBRO studies that we've undertaken in 2022 and 2023. What we do know is that although when we apply for the emergency authorization, like in all previous years, the rate is 25% lower than when we were using it when it was fully approved, that will give you 10 weeks protection. We saw that very, very clearly in 22 and 2023. And then any other mitigation that you deploy on farm agronomic practices will support that. And I'm sure we'll be talking about hygiene this afternoon. But just remember, there are sprays available whether you've used seed treatments or not. So if you have used Cruiser, there are 2 foliar sprays that can be used. They have to go in a certain order. So you have to go with a flunicamide-based product first, either Affinto or Topiki, at the threshold of 1 green wingless aphid per 4 plants up until the 12-leaf stage, which then increases to 1 per plant up until the 16-leaf stage. And then if you need to go again, then you have the Certis product acetamiprid Insist as the follow-on spray. Now, if you're not using a seed treatment and you've decided not to take that option, then currently at the moment we have 2 foliar sprays that are fully approved, and you can use those in any order, very much again like last year. And so you can either go with flunicamide or acetamiprid at the same thresholds, but if you then need a second spray, you flip them round, and that goes in that second spot. And the industry, as we stand today, are currently working out a strategy for a third product, which will have to come through an emergency authorization. We don't know what that will be at the moment. We're in discussions with various people, but as soon as we know and we have clarity, we will let you know what that will be, to give those growers without seed treatments the option of 3 sprays to control. So that's where we are with the seed treatments. Clearly, with the aphids migrating as relatively early in April, we are getting asked questions about strategy. Many of those were picked up in the bulletin that Simon and I sent out by Ches on Friday, but also remember there is a maximum seed rate that you can use for using Cruiser at 1.15. That is the same as last year again, and I know some of you will want to go higher than that. There's the debate about whether you blend and put in some untreated seed or you block accordingly, so you know exactly where your Cruiser seed is to your untreated seed, because then you can treat your untreated seed with 3 sprays. If you blend, you can only use 2 sprays. And then clearly there are the follow-on crop restrictions like we had last year, and which species you can and can't grow, because you cannot then sow flowering crops for a number of years after that. But that table, although I can remember many of them, the actual table is in the bulletin, and that lists the species within that. If it's not listed, you have to treat it as a restricted species, and it will have to sit in that column. But those informations are all there. But clearly, we are on the verge of another aphid year, and hopefully, we don't go for emergency authorizations lightly. It takes a lot of time to put these together, and then we have to discuss with government to actually get approval. But what this hopefully does is enable the BBRO and the wider industry to find and identify and further test the longer term strategies that are going to be so important that we'll need, whether that's genetics, agronomy, IPM, other aphicides that are going to be important as we go forward. So that's a quick summary, Simon, and we can pick up any questions if there are around that.
Thank you, Mark. Are there any immediate questions to Mark about the virus forecast itself before we get into other things? So again, if you want to raise your hand or write them in the chat is sometimes easier, then everybody can see them. So that's fine. So there's a question there, Mark. Can you see that one? So Mark, when you say another aphid year, do you mean like 2020?
Well, I hope not, Alex, but clearly 2024 sits between 2020 and 22-23. So it isn't quite the same. The aphids are anticipated to arrive 2 weeks later. But I suppose my concern is, given how wet it has been throughout the entire winter in the UK, there will be some who will not be able to get onto the land quickly. And we also need to bear in mind that until we knew the Cruiser decision and the virus forecast, then the likes of Germain's and KWS couldn't process the seed. So they've now started that. But Simon put in the bulletin expected delivery dates, and for Cruiser seed, it won't be until early April. And that has an implication. If you've gone for non-cruiser seed that hopefully has been delivered from on farm from this week onwards. But it's all about hopefully finding a window, and if we have a situation where land isn't fit, and crop is not sown until we get into April, we have a situation where aphids could well be flying into crops just as they're emerging, which then puts it similarly to what we saw in 2020. And we all know the smaller the plant, the more attractive they are, and the issue that has for A, aphid buildup, and B, virus transmission and spread. And unfortunately, we are starting to see one or two aphids out there. I found them in the garden. You probably say, well, I would do because I work on aphids and I've brought them home. But we are starting to find them in oilseed rape crops in the berry area. And I do know that we have been finding, with some of the comments from agronomists, about cereal aphids in wheat and barley. And it doesn't really matter what species they are. That just tells me that the weather pattern that we've experienced over the last 4 or 5 months has been so mild that the aphids have been able to survive and starting to build and propagate, and will start to then fly into the crops as we get into early mid-April. And that's the concern. If they're there now, they will build. And clearly, the virus yellows forecast doesn't take into consideration heavy rain events or even strong wind events. But even if it has had some sort of mitigation, which it may have done, by finding aphids as we are at this stage of the season, that tells me that aphids have been able to survive and start to put pressure on the crop as we go forward. And then clearly, then linking to that, hygiene is critical. So with a crop that's still being harvested, and then with spoilage heaps and groundkeepers and anything else that are out there, we need to make sure we are controlling those. We'll continue to push that. I also appreciate how difficult it is with the conditions that we're faced with. But that potentially provides sources of virus for aphids to acquire, and we need to minimize that risk as much as possible. And that goes for cover crops and weeds as well, because anything that is left over and putting the pressure on is going to cause concern. And it's not just aphids and virus. We also need to think about this also providing things like downy mildew and even Cercospora and other foliar diseases as we go forward.
Thank you, Mark. Perhaps come back to hygiene just in a little while. They'll give you a chance to gulp some tea down. There's a good question there. How does location affect the date of aphid appearance?
Bruce, that's a really good question. Thank
Links
you for
versus
that.
Suffolk, yeah.
Yeah, that's really good. So you are correct in what you say. So there is a lag. So the data that we get from Rothamsted, there are 2 suction traps, which we use as the key reference points. The predicted first flight at the Brooms Barn site, which is near Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk, is the 10th of April. The second one is the Curtain site in South Lincolnshire, and that's about a week later. So at the moment, there is about a lag of a week to 10 days. But if we do get a period of warm weather right across the sugar beet area, and I don't know if you've looked at the Met Office charts, basically the whole of the sugar beet area is in the red footprint, which shows you just how warm it is. It can actually reduce that timing. But what BBRO will do, like we've always done for many years, is we'll monitor aphid populations for you. So BBRO will be using the Yellow Water Pan network at all our reference sites, and we will be monitoring aphids that are flying into the crop. And then we will have an additional 35 sites that we will actually be doing accounts on. So we'll be looking at 50 sites, and then we'll be counting the green wingless on those sites as well. And we will then put that information on the BBRO website. It will be real-time information that you can click onto and see what's going on. Don't use it as an excuse to let you go and spray. You use that as a reference point to then go and check your own crops, because what's going to be critical this year with the tools that we have or haven't got, we need to look after those aphicide sprays. So only use them as it should be once you get to threshold, and check that. Although I also appreciate, at that time of year it's very busy. So clearly we need to take all those factors into consideration. But yeah, keep an eye on the BBRO bulletins and the website. It will be updated daily.
So, Stephen, there's a great question there. Maybe I'll just jump in before Mark answers that, because I think it's all related to actually risk, isn't it, of virus transfer. I mean, Mark mentioned hygiene. Obviously, that anything which can potentially host aphids, which may or may not have the virus, but effectively between now and when aphids arrive, we really need to make sure we're getting rid of all potential sources for them, or hosts of them, don't we, Mark?
Yeah.
I mean, the first one I would just remind you of, if you haven't, hopefully cover crops. Some of you might be going cover crops. Hopefully, you've seen our messaging on this. We need a good minimum 5 to 6 week period between getting rid of all the last green material of that cover crop and effectively drilling sugar beet. I suspect we're okay, but don't leave it too long. You need a while sometimes for that biomass to get destroyed, however you might be doing it. Obviously, if you're grazing it, make sure you're dealing with the regrowth, because that might regrow again as well. So you may need a follow-up spray with glyphosate, but you'll all have different strategies. I know harvest has been difficult and is difficult, but I'm seeing some nightmares of spoil heaps, particularly land under mouse clamps. Where not all the roots have been lifted. In fact, I went past one the other day and there was an awful lot of root left. But what worried me was how green it had gone, which I think really just vindicates how warm it has been. They were actually very large plant leaves coming on those roots now. Some of them have got 6-7 leaves and they're expanding. So we need to be really mindful of trying to get rid of all those kind of sources. And destroying them as soon as possible. In some cases, you just won't be able to get on the land to do it. I totally understand that, but as soon as you can, make sure you know where your potential weak spots are, and as soon as you can, you either get on, spray them off, plough them in, whatever is appropriate. And I suppose that does leave the question of, obviously, you've questioned about drilling beet next to beet where beet is still. I don't know if you remember, that's sugar beet or is that energy beet? I mean, AD beet, I imagine, Stephen, is it? Hopefully all sugar beet for processing for sugar will be gone by then.
It's definitely unharvested sugar beet. Some of the fields still underwater.
No, it's unharvested. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. And have you got? Is it yours or somebody else's?
Well, ours. They're not. I think they're a contract farm crop. Yeah. So.
Okay.
But I walked on it this morning. There's no way we're going to get near the field for it. The water needs to disappear. The water table's so high, you can hardly walk on it, let alone harvest beet.
Yeah. Stephen, was there much virus in that crop when symptoms of expressing back in August, September, October time?
No, they all look fairly clean at the moment, but there's a lot of deteriorated roots in there. There was a bit of frost damage in there. There was some fat hen in there, which the frost seemed to affect the beet in where there was more fat hen. And there's a multitude of issues there: deteriorated roots, water logging, and potentially, obviously, a factory closing, and we're not going to get them in. Yeah,
I appreciate that, and that potential is a risk, and we have to think wider than the aphids then, Stephen, sadly, because things like, as I said, downy mildew and the foliar diseases like Cercospora could well uptick because of that. So do whatever you can to minimize the risk, but appreciate the commercial difficulties that faces on farm when you've got that situation, given the season we've just had.
It's very difficult.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, and it's very easy for us to say get rid of it and destroy it, but you need to get some value returned on that crop somehow, don't you? Possibly.
Yeah, right.
I obviously get that. Is that good question there from David? How much of this year's crop do you expect it will be grown from Cruiser? Very similar to last year. If we say a 60-40 split, so 60% treated with Cruiser, 40%. I think that's about right, isn't it, Mark? Might be a few percent either way, but broadly similar. Then a question about seed insecticide. Mark, can you see that one? Do you want to answer that one about effectivity of Cruiser?
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. So clearly as the seedling develops, it will be picking up from the seed coat. So yeah, your 2-leaf seedling should be well protected and should give you protection up until the 10-week stage, by which time you are, probably at 8, 10 true leaves, hopefully, given the season. So if the aphids do come in early and you have used Cruiser, then you should be getting some really good protection from aphid control. So clearly, you shouldn't hopefully have too much to worry about. You can't stop an aphid feeding, and it needs to feed to pick up the chemistry. If it's carrying the virus, excuse me, if it's carrying the virus, then it will transmit the virus. But what we're trying to stop with any strategy like this is secondary spread. And if you stop secondary spread, then you're going to minimize the risk of those patches forming and having an impact on your yield performance later in the season. So that's really, really important.
I think if we can't stop aphids feeding, what we can do is, both for Cruiser and non-Cruiser, we need to do everything we can to encourage those crops to grow really quickly. We want them to germinate. We want them to get to establishment, 6-leaf stage, but ideally, as Mark says, push on really quickly to the 10-leaf stage when we know they're beginning to acquire mature plant resistance. And as Mark says, hopefully Cruiser might take us through that period of time without a second spray, but there's no doubt about it, any non-Cruiser will need foliar insecticide protection. And obviously the shorter we can make that period, i.e. the faster the crop growth, the better. We can talk a little bit about things, and I'll probably ask Alistair to talk about use of undersown barley, because that's another tool which we have been asked questions about, but we've got a few other questions. John, do you have a question? You got your hand up.
Yes. Could you say whether there will be any more Cruiser available? Because obviously with the season, it might be possible practically to get more seed, but in a normal year you wouldn't be in that situation.
Yeah. We have had that question asked, and we have asked, obviously BBRO aren't involved in the treatment of the seed, but I think the answer is unequivocally that they're unable to treat any more seed with Cruiser at this point in time. They have to focus on treating what they need.
Okay,
is that right, Mark? Yeah,
that is correct. So as Simon said, it's outside of our remit, John, but British Sugar and the NFU had agreed by that time commitment, and that was 60% of the area from the information that had been sent in by your good selves when you put the seed orders together. And unfortunately, there's no opportunity to treat any further seed, regardless of the forecast. We are where we are.
Thank you, John, for that. Dave, that's a good question. I mean, we have been collecting data from the last years. I'll let Mark or Alistair. Do you want to answer that one, Mark?
Let me read it.
Yeah. So how have growers fared in controlling aphids and virus over the last couple of years, particularly where they're just relying on foliars?
So it is a good question. In 2022, where we had a high forecast and we did use, we had problems being able to appreciate what was virus and what wasn't, because if you remember, that was the drought year. And we had a lot of the crop had lost its canopy, and we also then had the beet moth on top of it. So it was very difficult to work out exactly what was virus and what wasn't. So even with the assessments, we didn't actually come and draw a figure for that year. Last year, the forecast was high, but actually for many, the virus yellows, regardless of use of Cruiser or sprays, the national incidence was 1%. So you're going to say, well, that's good news, and as long as you've got a mitigation in there, that's fine. What was interesting in 2023, and why every year is so different, is this is where the beauty of monitoring comes in. In 2023, I don't know if many of you can remember, but May in East Anglia, particularly for Norfolk, Suffolk and Essex, we had a northerly drift off the North Sea. The temperatures went down, and the aphid populations became static and didn't increase. And so actually when the crop was growing away, we were seeing relatively few aphids coming into the crop. And so the pressure was lower than we were anticipated. Now, having said that, we were monitoring further west. If you went the other side of the A1 and went north, actually last year from all our monitoring operations, we actually identified 75% of all the aphids in the Newark factory area. And BBRO sites, we went through 3 aphicide sprays to keep the aphids out. The good news was there wasn't too much virus, but the problem, one of the challenges with aphids and virus yellows, it's not like it's a direct problem. It's only if the aphids are carrying virus are you going to see an issue. So there were some subtle differences, but the good news was most of the crop fared pretty well with the strategies that were deployed. But we do know from work that we did in 2020 with the sprays, we could see good value compared to the untreated of using those strategies.
Thank you, Mark. Alistair, did you want to just mention about undersowing with barley? Something you've had a look at as one of our alternative strategies. It's not for everybody and it's quite demanding as a tool, but it's probably worth mentioning it.
I certainly can. Thank you, Simon. Good afternoon, everybody. Want to be in this situation with the aphid pressure so high, but in the past is the use of the undersown cereals. Some people are sort of touting this as the silver bullet, and this will solve all our problems. It won't. And for those of you that attended Beet Tech, I did put up the slide then showing the yield work we had done, looking at the effect of the barley virus, and it is clear that the effect from using the cereal does cover the beet and removes that contrast that the aphids use for host finding, but from the beet versus the barley was, I think, in 5 out of the 6 fields we looked at, actually the yield was worse where the cereal had been used. So that's not to say don't use it, and we volunteers and help from those of you who will be using undersown barley anyway to stop wind blow, wishes to try it for aphids this year, please feel free to get in touch. But really we need to be very precise with our timing of destruction of that. So it may not protect you from those aphids much later on, but hopefully the early ones that and we seem to know they're the ones that tend to carry the most virus. So we've got no blueprint for using it at the moment, but it's something we'll continue to monitor and work on.
Thank you, Alistair. If you're not familiar with this approach, there's a document on the BBRO website on our opinions page, which outlines broadly how to do it, although I would echo it, we can't use that as a blueprint, but the kind of tools and tactics and the approaches you need. So if you want to find out a bit more about it, have a read, and then you can always pick up the phone or drop us an email if you want a little bit more advice. Any oh, here we go. Final question from David. Any top tips, Mark, on relying solely on foliar sprays?
The top, well, attention to detail is everything, as we know with sugar beet. High reward, high risk crop. Really do keep an eye out on the information that we're providing. Make sure you're looking or your agronomist is checking it. So we know if you're not using cruiser, then and depending on the pressure, there's a subtle difference between acetamiprid versus flunicimid. And then, so if you get a large number early, you may want to go with a quick knockdown product to take them out, which would definitely put acetamiprid first because you've got that flexibility. We know that flunicimid, whether it's Affinto or Topiki, is slower acting because of its mode of action. So I would stay agile when it comes to making a decision on that. If you get to threshold and numbers aren't too big, I may go down the flunicimid route first, and then you've still got acetamiprid to get there. But I'm not quite sure of your land type, but it's also about trying to get it to the 12-leaf stage as quick as possible. I would look to try and maximize and get the crop in when conditions are right. You don't want a gappy crop stand if you can avoid that. That will only attract more aphids for longer. So it's building all those things together to minimize the risk, making sure you can get 100,000 plants per hectare and get them all to the same growth stage as quickly as possible.
Not wanting to draw too many comparisons of 2020 because it's fearful, but I think one of the lessons we learned there, just building on what you've just said, is getting that crop into a good seed bed. If you remember back to 2020, it was incredibly dry. Hopefully that won't be the case this year, but it might be difficult to get some seed beds. But patience was absolutely key, and certainly a lot of the later drill crops which went into a better seed bed, certainly more warmth. Warmth is the big driver of leaf production, of course, but moisture, so good seed soil contact, often performed a lot better in terms of emerging faster, higher plant population, and actually we could see that manifested in lower virus content as well. So patience, I know we say that every year, but this could be the year, particularly for cruiser. Don't rush into those seed beds, particularly if it's cold. And of course, if you've got young plants struggling in a poor seed bed, looking very yellow and pale, they're very attractive to aphids, and of course they're very slow to develop as well. So yeah, I think just have a good look. Don't be afraid, to just to delay it by a few days. The difference between 5 degrees and 8 degrees in terms of germination and emergence is massive. I mean, seed barely emerges at 5, but 8 you'll get stuff through the ground in 5, 6, 7, 8 days, sorry, longer, but it'll be germinating much quicker. So keep looking, keep monitoring temperatures. They're currently sitting around about 5 degrees, although they have been higher, but we're just fluctuating a little bit with these frosts and slightly colder periods. So I think we need to have to choose a moment carefully.
And Stephen just put in the chat whether blackgrass could host Mysis persicae. It's also a good question, because I've just been seeing some work elsewhere in the world about Mysis persicae and cereals and monocots as a host, but I would not see that as a major issue at all. And for most of the work I've seen and read over the years, it's a non-host for Mysis persicae. It's certainly also a non-host for the viruses. So I would discount that as an issue for your sugar beet crop and virus yellows.
David, just to respond to your question, I think it depends on the area you've got to get drilled, and of course, if we are talking about going early and still cold, just bear in mind bolting risk, of course, and choose your varieties carefully. But certainly there is a big difference between certainly 5 and 8, but certainly, yeah, you will find it will germinate much faster. And not temperature, but also think about the quality of the seed bed you're getting as well. Any other questions? Oh, I've got a question for Alistair, if you're still with us. With all this moisture in the land, how worried should we be about nematodes, particularly of the free-living kind?
Thank you, Simon. Yes, I think
I don't know if other people have been having a problem with Alistair's microphone, but he keeps cutting in and out.
Yeah. Try again, Alistair. Maybe switch your camera off.
I'll turn my camera off.
Yeah.
Does that help?
Better.
We'll see.
Okay. Yes, something to consider as an as a risk, and something we need to just be aware of, especially those on those lighter soil types that are far more prone to free-living nematode damage. Yes, you could do some testing, but I think every field will come back positive with some level of nematode. So it is really a case of good consolidated seedbed will limit the spread of the nematodes to the seedlings. And if you can, consider using NemGuard. It's the only product we do have and we have had some fairly promising results in our trials. So it is there, but it's a risk versus reward situation, again, to stack up. But if you want the crop to grow away well, and get to that 12-leaf stage, we've got to consider what's going on underground as well, and nematode damage but whether it's beet cyst or free living types, will hinder the canopy growth and expansion.
And given it's going to be probably a wet start to spring, in addition to the nematodes, we just need to reflect on other things that may be out there. So Aphanomyces, blackleg, could well show its hand. It's a disease that likes moisture plus warm seed beds. Now, the good news is you use tachygarin to stop that, so most of you should be fine. But we did see some last year, and it's just worth keeping an eye on it, because often the later you sow with a warming seedbed, particularly in April, can mean you'll get those blackleg symptoms. But you've done everything right. All the seed is treated. It's just another one we need to keep an eye on.
Is that risk, if I remember rightly, Mark, is that risk slightly higher if you're in a slightly lower pH situation, slightly
Correct.
more acidic soil?
Correct, exactly.
So again, be aware of where you are sitting on lower pH. It's certainly lower than 6.5 probably.
Yeah.
Slightly more.
Yeah, and liming helps to mitigate that as well. So if you use lime and tachygarin, both will play a role in minimising its impact.
Sorry, Mark. John, you got your hand up. Fire away.
Yes, it's just a thought, really. With it being such a desperate spring with the wet conditions, how do you view a sort of nil cultivation approach to an approach where you cultivate to try and perhaps warm the soil up and try and let a bit of air in to dry it? Do you have any views on that?
It's a very good question. Again, it's a really difficult one to provide an answer to, because it depends so much on soil type and condition, isn't it? I think, yeah, I mean, it depends, and it's depending on what the weather happens between now and then, doesn't it, really? I think you're going to be trying to minimize movement anyhow, aren't you, really, because of the ability just to travel on the land, and we may just have to raise everything, go a little bit shallower. I mean, just remember what we're trying to produce is that seed bed at top 7 centimeters of a kind of nice fine consolidated, and then we're drilling into that at around 2 or 3. But we can talk about draw depth in a moment, because obviously once you start going deeper, it can be much.
We've lost Simon now. I'm not doing very well this afternoon. He looks in pain the way we've left him. So yeah, I'll try and pick up his thought process. So yeah, clearly as you go deeper, you're putting additional stress on the seedling to emerge, and that can have a consequence, John. So
I'm
back.
Sorry. My internet just dropped out there. Critical time. It wasn't because the question was that difficult. I chose not to. Can you hear me? All right.
We can, yes. Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. So yeah, I think there's some sense in looking at it, but it's going to be very much a case what's appropriate for your land job. I think you're thinking, do the minimum you can, but don't try and compromise that soil bed, seed bed still. But yeah, hopefully the warmth will come. When we saw it last year, if you remember, those crops went in and they sat there because there was no warmth, and the minute the warmth came away, that crop grew phenomenally quickly, didn't it? It almost went from 4 leaves to almost 10 leaves in 12 days. Never staggers me the ability of sugar beet to do that. Again, but you've got to make sure it's got its feet, its roots down into some good seed bed, access to nitrogen, which is important, and moisture. But just I mentioned planting depth. Just be careful we're not going too deep early on, assuming there is some moisture there. I was going to mention, Mark, if it's okay, just to talk. Obviously, those of you who've perhaps got both cruiser and non-cruiser seed on the farm, very, very important to make sure you know where everything's gone. You're probably aware from the seed list there's quite a range of different pellets, and there's going to be quite a range of different colours arriving on farm. Anything coming in Jermaine's box, which is a cruiser, will be red, so that's quite clear. But be aware, as I understand it, from if you've got KWS seed, the cruiser and the non-cruiser will all be orange. So you'll have to be really clear, and you obviously make sure you know what's been put where. So particularly using a contractor to drill, make sure he knows what's what and where it's gone, because it's important we do know where everything is, not just from the point of view of traceability though, but if you have got different varieties in the field, and I'm sure you've all heard me say this again, sometimes those varieties can emerge and develop particularly early on at different rates, which can make decisions around herbicide timings quite tricky. If you've got some varieties just at cotyledon stage, some at first true leaves, that's quite a critical stage. So just knowing and telling people where everything is. So I think you have to be aware to do some good mapping this year, or keep making sure a photograph sometimes of the label so you can GPS it, or what free word it is quite useful, so you've got good traceability of everything. Have we got any more questions? Got about
Would
15 minutes.
Cruisers? Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, say that again, Andrew.
Would you drill cruiser seed first or last, given the spring that we're facing? I have some cruiser and some untreated.
It depends on your soil type in the field you're going to put it on, but I would probably... That is a good question. I'd probably put it in second, because you're going to get the protection from if it goes in slightly later and it then coincides with the main aphid migration, it will give you that protection. But I can argue it both ways.
You need to remember that
I was asking the question.
Yeah,
it is a tricky one, and it depends. I mean, you're going to have your non-cruiser seed on farm earlier as well, probably by as much as a week, 10 days. And if you can get a seed bed, it makes sense to put your non-cruiser in first while you can, rather than leave everything until later on.
Yeah, that's a good point, Simon. If you've got the land fit and you've only got non-cruiser on farm, you're going to put that in first.
Let's do.
Yes.
Because it may be the first week in April before you get your cruiser seed. Because the trouble is, we have to wait. It's part of the stipulation and everything else from DEFRA and health and safety. Clearly we can't process anything until we know we've triggered it. That then delays Jermaine's and KWS, and that sadly means they've only just started finishing off the seed with the cruiser. If you get your non-cruiser on and fields become fit in the next 2 or 3 weeks, you're going to bang that in first.
But
I would think it'll take if our fields are travelable, I would think, at the present moment.
Yeah, and that's the other challenge, for everybody.
Yeah, but rest assured, I know at Jermaine that process is already underway. They've started to treat already this morning. They were all teed up. I think product was due to get here, wasn't it? So I think that process, they would do it as quickly as they can. John, you've still got your hand up. I think you just haven't put it down, have you?
Yeah.
No? Okay. Are there any other questions for the team, BBRO team, regarding? I mean, obviously we talked a lot about virus, and it's absolutely right that we do. Any broader questions?
I was just about to flag. Clearly, we've talked a lot about aphids and made a comment about nematodes and some of the foliar diseases. But we just need to be aware of 1 or 2 other things out there to maximise the return on the next crop. So the last plant clinic sample we had into Norwich, into the team a couple of weeks ago, was some samples from the North Norfolk coast up near the Sandringham estate. And as soon as I saw them, I think I knew what it was, but it hadn't been picked up. And it was actually, once we got them in the lab and did some dissections, it was beet moth larvae. So beet moth, as you know, caused a big problem in 2022 for some of you, particularly in East Anglia and the berry factory area. The good news is in 2023, because of the weather pattern that we had and intermittent rain at the right time through the summer months, kept it to a minimum, although clearly we did see some of it late August into September. But what it does serve as a timely reminder that beet moth can survive down to -15, particularly when it's tucked into the heart or the petioles of a sugar beet plant or crown or groundkeeper. And we mustn't dismiss the importance of that pest. Now, if conditions don't favour it, that'd be fantastic. It means we've had some rain through the season, and rain's a good insecticide. But what we did find last year is that we put out pheromone traps, which gave us an indication, we think, of moth species. So that's something else we will be putting out, although we're still making sure they're actually detecting the right species. But we did do a very late insecticide trial where we did start to see some moth larval activity that some of you saw at Fotheringay when we did the beet field events. The data from that was inconclusive because the population wasn't high and we didn't see any differences on yield, but we are doing further work on that to try and identify strategies, because at the moment the only recommended approach for moth control, larval control, is using pyrethroids, and the last thing we really want to be doing is applying pyrethroids in, say, May time, just when the aphids are flying and the beneficials are increasing, because the beneficials will be taken out and they have a role to play. And we know about 80 to 90% of the aphid population are resistant to pyrethroids. So it's getting that balance right. We're hoping ultimately something like a diamide that you're probably used for using in other crops would have efficacy against beet moth, but we just need to ensure that's the case from our analysis and trials. And then we'll have to go on a journey about getting them approved for sugar beet. But yeah, but just keep an eye out. If you start seeing any early signs of black hearts in May and early June, then let us know, because there's several reasons. It could be downy mildew, it could be boron deficiency, but it also could be early signs of beet moth.
Mark, that's probably quite a good appropriate point to Alistair. We'll just take a few make some comments about our monitoring network, because increasingly we have to monitor crops so carefully for both emerging pests and existing one. Alistair, do you want to just kind of talk through what we're doing again this year?
Thanks, Simon. I'll stay hidden just in case it causes problems. But yeah, so hopefully you've all seen in the Beet Review the article I wrote on the monitoring sites and how we've expanded from just looking at aphids. This year we're going to have 17 sites. I've just been putting the finishing touches on the map this morning, so they're more evenly spread across the growing area. So you should be able to log on to the website and you'll definitely see the aphid data from nearby, but over the year we're hoping to build on, bring in real-time Cercospora testing from the spore traps, some leaf testing, but also observations on weather. We've bought some new weather stations that will go out on 4 of the sites, monitor how the crops are growing, really to give us some insights in really fine detail on how the 17 fields are growing. But of course that's just a handful of the 10,000 or so fields, or however many there will be out there, but really it's to give us that in-depth insight and early warning on when we start seeing pests or disease pressure building.
Thanks, Alistair. Andrew, got your hand up. Andrew Wilson.
Yeah, you mentioned NemGuard earlier on, Simon. Just wondered if I've dabbled with it a little bit, but not to any scientific level. Just wondered if you had any best advice on dose rates or thresholds for application.
I'll swiftly pass that one to Alistair, because he's the NemGuard specialist in BBRO.
And he uses it on his own.
What a title to have.
I know.
We recommend 10 kilos because it is an expensive product, Andrew. So, but we have seen, even in the dry year when we did some trials, when was that? 2022. We even saw a positive response in 2022 up in Selby. So whether it's just an nematicidal effect or whether there's a add-on of some kind of stimulatory effect from the garlic, can't be sure, but it definitely paid for itself in that year. And I thought if there's any year it's not going to work, it would be a really dry year. So a really dry, really wet spring like we're having now, it definitely should be out there doing its job. And there is a wealth of data out there. It's just we haven't got a lot of our own at this stage. But yeah, 10 kilos.
Was that applied at a given threshold, Alistair?
No, not really. Just on fields with known nematode problems. There are some historic thresholds out there, but I wouldn't say they're particularly reliable. So if you know, especially if you used to use Vide, for example, it's definitely worth considering switching over. And if you do want to get some testing done, feel free then to get in contact, and I'm happy to look at the results and work out if there is a significant threat or not. But given how wet it is, I think the nematodes will be well up in the water table, or probably, for some of you, probably floating around just below the surface, so poised and waiting to pounce on the beet when they do appear.
Yeah, well, would you get, in potato language, we've been told to not sample if the soil's colder than 10 degrees. Would you agree with that?
Yes, because the nematodes will have moved down to where it's warmer, deeper down. So, and likewise, if it's too wet, they're probably will be further down where there's hopefully some aerated pockets as well. But fickle beasts to try and find and protect against. But yes, you're right. Getting testing done at the right time under the right conditions is vital.
Absolutely. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Alistair. Time is moving on. We're probably near our last 5 minutes. So if we've got any more questions, take your opportunity. Otherwise, I should just talk. John, you got your hands up twice. Both hands.
Yes, Simon. I would make a wish that British Sugar would start and be proactive. You trainers in all the aspects of the sugar beet crop, and we can't get the seed we want. I applied for sugar beet. Our Wi-Fi went down. I contacted 3 people at British Sugar on the morning of that it was announced. And I got through to Philip Eccleston at 12 o'clock, and there was no seed available. So I could neither get the best insecticide nor any of the 4 varieties I wanted. And this really is pathetic. They've got to change. We could be ordering the seed for 25, 26 crop now. Why aren't they doing it?
John, I mean, we've talked about this, and I absolutely understand your frustration, and I know many share that. I think we should acknowledge that some of the roots of the problem with lack of availability of seed was some very severe flooding in areas where the seed was produced. Italy, I think, was one of the areas, and obviously there's just not been the volume. I don't think it's entirely down to mismanagement, and we need to recognise and understand that. But I think,
but Simon, the same situation occurred the year before. Why do they organise it in such a chronically inefficient manner?
Okay. Well, I think we all recognise the importance of using varieties more tactically, and it's been one of my missions to really get us to do that more often. We have to make sure we're very clear on the varieties we want for next year. It does link me in quite nicely, because one of the things I did want to mention when we finish, we will have our normal beet field events at our demo farms this year. So we will be down in, we'll be actually down in Suffolk, we'll be at Morley, we'll be at Baston, Fen, Lincoln, and we're going to be up at Selby as well. The reason I mention it, we will have all the RL varieties there. So again, please come and have a look at them. We'll probably be there twice during the season. We'll probably time a visit prior to around aphids and foliar sprays, and again probably pre-campaign. I'm not trying to divert away from what you said, John, but I said the more we can stress and make it clear we want certain varieties, the more advanced warning and send signals I think will help the process, because it's not perfect, I agree. And let's be clear, and we need to be able to use the varieties and their traits more effectively in the future. So please come along and see us, and of course we will be there, and we'll have plenty of time for discussions then, and hopefully not too far from you. Right, 3 minutes left. Any final questions? If there aren't, hopefully you found that useful. The objective was today to provide you an opportunity to talk about obviously the forecast and virus. I'm sure you've still got lots of questions. You know where we are. Please drop us a line, phone us, or use our email address, or come to one of our events. They'll always be well advertised in the bulletin. We will be starting, well, we started already, we do continue with our regular advisory bulletins, trying to keep it topical, and as the season progresses, we'll make sure you get all the necessary information in there. I'd just like to thank all my colleagues from BBRO for joining us and helping out and sharing their knowledge with us. So thank you very much, guys. And to finish on, just look forward to seeing you later in the season. Hopefully we'll get some crop in the ground, hopefully in good conditions, and we'll catch up with you later in the year.